Welcome, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, From Alone to Together, Navigating the Crisis of Belonging and Community on Campus. I'm Jim McCartan of Fordham University's Theology faculty. I'm the chair of the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education, which publishes the magazine Conversations on Jesuit Higher Education, the sponsor of today's webinar. Before we begin, I want to invite audience members to share your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any time. Later in the program, panelists will have a chance to respond. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, Michelle Murray, Senior Vice President for Student Development and Mission at the College of the Holy Cross. Michelle began her higher ed career in 1996 with a 10-year stint on the Student Affairs team of Loyola of Maryland. Thereafter, she served as Vice President of the Division of Student Development at Seattle University before arriving at the College of the Holy Cross in 2017. Michelle is a current member of the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education, and so I have the pleasure of working alongside her sometimes. Michelle, thanks for moderating today, and thanks again to everybody for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Jim, and welcome to our panelists and welcome to all of you who are joining us from home. I really appreciate your participation. Today, we are exploring an aspect of well-being that many of us have noticed on our campuses, an increase in loneliness and isolation. And we're asking how we can move from a growing cultural trend toward social detachment, toward healthier relationships and a greater experience of authentic community. We will explore these issues through the lenses of faculty, staff, and students, and through the disparate experiences of those who may feel on the margins of our campus communities, namely those who identify as LGBTQ and/or persons of color, as well as those whose religious or faith commitments are something other than Catholic or are none at all. I'm fortunate to be joined by 4 esteemed colleagues who will each offer words of wisdom before joining me in a robust conversation. And finally, as Jim mentioned, we will open the floor to you and your questions. So first, let me officially introduce and welcome our panelists. First, we have David Marcotte. He is a priest of the Society of Jesus and a member of the Department of Psychology at Fordham University in New York, where he teaches a popular undergraduate course called How to Live a Happy Life that was featured on the Today Show. David's research and clinical work focuses on the relationship between socialization and personality, particularly on the role of mindfulness in facilitating resilience and post-traumatic self-care. Jody O'Brien is a professor of sociology and interim associate provost at Seattle University. Jody's research has focused largely on religion in LGBTQ+ communities. And among her many leadership roles, Jody now serves as director and principal investigator for a National Science Foundation funded project called SU Advance, which is geared toward aligning Seattle U's institutional expectations and faculty reward structures with the university's mission. Deb Katie Meltzer is the new Vice President for Student Development and Dean of Students at Loyola University of Maryland. Prior to arriving at Loyola this summer, Deb served as Vice President for Student Affairs at Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts. And prior to that, she was Vice President and Title IX Coordinator at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York. She received her PhD in Higher Ed Administration from Boston College. Lots of Jesuit connections there. And finally, rounding out our panel is Omar Muzaffar, who serves as Muslim chaplain at Loyola University Chicago, where he also teaches courses in theology and literature. For decades, Omar has earned a reputation as an advocate for underrepresented communities, including refugees and victims of sexual violence. Loyola has honored him both as Staff Member of the Year and as a recipient of Transformative Educator Award. So that is our esteemed panelists, and I will first turn it over to David, who will provide some remarks, and then we'll follow with Jody, Deb, and Omar.
Thank you, Michelle. This afternoon, I thought I would like to share with you, in terms of the broad dimensions of the current crisis, some opportunities for both differentiation and integration that can be, on the one hand, severe threats when they're not achieved, and on the other hand, real vectors for integration. Each of these as well can be a place of intervention where our efforts can be supportive to help students along their way. So the first challenge is the challenge of navigating transitions. If you've ever watched someone taking swimming lessons, or if you yourself have been trained to swim, you know that that crucial moment comes when you have to let go of the edge of the pool and venture out into the water without the teacher. But the teacher says, "I won't let you sink." And that reassurance enables many of us to take those first few steps and strokes in the water. So transitions, of course, like this are times of instability and stress for our students, leaving home, being separated from existing relationships and social networks and support, and the academic challenges that come with college life. All of these can lead to feelings of ambivalence, a mixture of both loss and exciting emerging feeling of opportunities for growth. The core element during these transitions is the capacity for trust. When students are able to trust these ambivalence feelings, and the process of growth can go more smoothly, but requires trustworthy individuals and trustworthy institutions. We have to be able to provide what we claim, to tell the truth, and to listen attentively and deeply to students. This can be, as we all know, an enormous support. A second challenge concerns constructing identity. Maya Angelou once remarked that I long, as does every human being, to be at home wherever I find myself. Of course, belonging to others, we must first belong to ourselves. So college is a unique time of critical identity experimentation and consolidation. And it relates to these transitions, during which growth and independence and personal responsibility takes place, where an awareness of natural abilities and interests and strengths and weaknesses can come forward, where values and goals are clarified. It is, of course, a time of social risk-taking, and the successful consolidation of these days enables the person to grow and mature. This identity construction depends critically on the quality of a listener, someone who can listen deeply for recognition to the individual and affirm what is there. The third dimension is developing social capital, or sustaining relationships, which is an antidote to the uncertainty that many people feel about belonging and the increased social fragmentation. Social capital is the resources that we accumulate through social relationships that enable us to use supportive mechanisms and to master the environment. Research has linked strong social capital to psychological well-being and positive mental health, to self-esteem, to satisfaction with life, to employability, to public health and lower crime. So the achievement of a measure of social capital is extremely important during these years. The fourth dimension that I'd like to mention is the achievement of meaning or sense of purpose in life. Scott Peck is a psychiatrist who wrote a book several years ago called The Road Less Traveled. And the first line in the book is, "Life is difficult." The myth of ease looms large in the imagination and beliefs of some of our students. So the difficulty of life can come as a revelation. I'm always surprised when I talk about this and I see the looks of disbelief on some faces in the classroom. So how do we cope with this difficulty and this challenge? The most tried and true method is through stories, in particular stories about the self and about others in relationship. Narrative identity can become a source of meaning. Dr. Dan McAdams, a psychologist who has written a great deal about this, suggests that a person's internalized and evolving life story, integrating the reconstructed past and imagined future that enables a sense of unity and purpose and meaning. This is the task of shaping the narrative identity. Narrative becomes then a root metaphor for psychology and many of the processes that we go through. The self is a story. The features of a psychologically capable personhood are embedded in history and society and culture. So we initially structure some of these stories around master narratives that are handed to us by the culture and by our parents. And through this process of storytelling, we're able to reconstruct the autobiographical past to imagine a future in a way that provides unity and purpose and meaning, according to McAdams. So this results in a sense of self that is connected and unified through a story. Themes of agency or communion or redemption or contamination or meaning making or exploration, all are elements of the narrative identity. So we can help university students to navigate these dimensions and achieve a coherent, positive resolution to their stories. Meaning making, of course, takes the person beyond the self. It's an antidote to self-absorption and enables a wide view of community from the self to the family to the local city, state, country, and ultimately to the world. So as a summary and final thought, managing transition, constructing identity, building social capital, and achieving a sense of meaning and purpose in life are 4 essential psychosocial challenges of personhood during these years. The known predictors of well-being are an supportive environment, social, emotional bonds with friends and family, the sense of belonging, and a sense of personal identity and confidence. Our challenge, of course, is to support students in shifting the internal narrative in their lives from I can't to I can, and to provide the essential nutriments and support for the process to succeed.
Wow, David, thank you very much for those grounding comments. Really appreciate you framing the issues for us. And at this point, I'd like to invite Jody to share some of the challenges and supports LGBTQ+ persons may experience on our Jesuit Catholic campuses. Jody?
Thank you, Michelle. And again, thank you, David, for those framing remarks. I had intended to begin, and I will begin, but then I want to integrate some of what you were saying by saying that for queer identified students, faculty, and staff, but especially students, since that's our focus here today, loneliness and isolation is a common experience. As you pointed out, David, and I find this language so useful myself as a social psychologist, the dominant narrative, or what I like to call the cultural scripts into which we are born, and that give us an idea of who we can be and how we can be in the world, for many of us who identify as queer, immediately spin us off. They tell us that we're not part of the story, or we're a problematic part of the story, or we don't belong in the story. And so much of the ongoing struggle for queer identified folk, and when I say queer identified, I'm using that as a kind of umbrella to speak to both gender and sexual identity. But this can be a source of ongoing struggle, and it's particularly fraught in that as a group of marginalized folk, we don't typically have other family members that we can turn to who might share, what might be an otherwise marginalized status. And so that loneliness and isolation is a common experience. I wanted to talk today a little bit about 3 things that I see as both, as you put it, David, contributors or aspects that are challenges, but it can also be vectors for integration and leading a much more vibrant experience. And the first one I simply call social media and popular culture do not reflect individual feelings and experiences, by which I mean that by way of positioning myself a bit, I arrived at Seattle University more than 25 years ago, and I was one of only 2 openly gay people on campus. And I have to say that the Jesuit community embraced me. They were eager to let me know that that they appreciated me and who I was, but I was definitely one of a very, 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 very tiny minority. This is what I like to call pre-Ellen days. Ellen had not come out in her sitcom, let alone her television program. There was no Will and Grace. And so in other words, going back to your language, David, there was no popular cultural narrative about what it was to be gay, particularly what it was to be somebody who was queer identified and could have the support of family, friends, and communities. You sort of had to figure that out on your own. Nowadays, fast forward, popular culture and social media make it seem that if you are a young person who has not figured out what your gender or sexual identity is, first of all, the idea is that you have to have one, and that you have to have figured it out, and it has to be fairly stable, even if the common denominator is that it's not stable, but that in some way or another you have to have articulated a gender and or sexual identity for yourself. Even that can be challenging, problematic, or possibly oppressive for folk who feel that they might not be aligned with traditional gender or dating or relationship narratives, but don't know where to fit themselves into that and don't see themselves reflected in any of the popular media. And it's surprising to people, but this is more common than you think. And so if the dominant script has become, oh, you know, we're here, we're queer, get used to it, let's go to Pottery Barn. Somebody told me I needed to update that, by the way, to IKEA or something. But you know, it can be very challenging for our students who are still trying to sort that out. Another popular stereotype or expectation is that you can't be a person of faith and also be queer identified. Much of my own scholarship for the last 20 years has been with folk who identify as openly queer and openly Christian, and the ways in which they have had to rewrite the narrative in order to play a role that is rewarding to them, that is self-affirming and life-giving, rather than somebody who's been spun off and damned. But again, students don't often come in with access to those narratives. They also are aware that popular media may portray them as promiscuous, as identity politics driven, as suffering, as agitative activists, as drama driven, that these are some of the ways in which people might stereotype them or think of them. The challenge with any and all of these stereotypes, particularly if you are constantly trying to figure out for yourself who you are in a culture in which the dominant narrative does not have a comfortable place for you, the challenge with these stereotypes is that they kind of get thrown onto you like a blanket. And then you have to try to present to others or indicate to others who you are through this blanket. So for folk who feel that their sense of self and who they are is pretty much in alignment with what they see as a common narrative or a common cultural script, they are enlivening or building on that sense of self. For folk on the margins who feel that they have to push back against the stereotypes imposed on them or tossed over on them, it can feel as if you're never really getting a sense of self because you're always having to combat or push back against the stereotypes. And in this regard, I include anyone, BIPOC students, queer students, any of those of us who have to push back against the stereotypes that we know have been imposed on us, because what that means relationally is that we're not digging into what is my sense of self in this moment, but I am in fact responding to what I know you're projecting onto me and moving around with regard to that. A second area, and I'm just going to touch on these briefly, and ideally we'll have some chance to connect the themes more generally in the discussion later. But a second theme is that well-intentioned practices of inclusion may do more harm than good. This one always raises a few eyebrows, but let me take the practice of pronouns as an example. If you're a queer person and you're about to go for a job interview, for example, or you're going to meet with a faculty member and you notice on their website or their tagline that they have some pronouns listed, that might make you feel some comfort. You say, okay, well, at least this person has some sense that there may be more than a binary set of gender identities out there, and it may give me some comfort. And it can work very well as a practice. If you're in a room and you are new to a university, you're new to a campus, you're still trying to make friends, and you are as gender confused, and I'll be honest with you, as I feel some days, and everybody decides in this well-intentioned way to go around the room and do pronouns, people who feel really clear about their pronouns, whether they're queer pronouns or binary pronouns, they feel clear about them, are really fine with that exercise, and they see it in some ways as a form of cultural capital. For those of us who are less comfortable, and I'll be honest, I wake up every day sometimes wondering about my own gender identity, that's a moment of pause for me on a good day. And on a less good day, I just feel a little uncomfortable. I feel myself stepping back from the group a little bit. I work with a lot of trans support groups, and I can tell you that in-group pronoun sharing is not necessarily always the first preference of this group of folk. On the other hand, it is something that some folk might want to share, and having the opportunity available for people to share should certainly be there, but it's a fraught path. The larger aspect of this, as I see it, and I'll kind of wrap this up in terms of my time, is this realization that for folk who are queer identified, coming out is not a single episodic event. It's something that we have to do over and over and over again. And it differs in every context that we're in. We make choices about safety. We make choices about people's receptivity. We make choices about what kind of language should be used. And so there's a whole series of master narratives that are going through our heads when we are in interaction with anyone. It can be very difficult to figure out a core sense of who you are when you're doing that much shifting, code switching, and trying to figure out who to be in different situations. And so as one of my colleagues likes to say, we come out over and over and over again, but when do we come home? What are some of the practices that we can do as universities and colleges to help our students feel like they're coming home? And my short answer to that is that knowledge really is power. Again, going back to the first, our students live in a world in which they're bombarded with popular culture and social media imagery that may not be relevant or resonant for them at all. Courses in the history and the struggle and the complexities of LGBTQ life can be very empowering to them. They really don't know as much as we might think that they know. Opportunities to engage with their larger set of intersections can be very helpful. For example, one of the most helpful groups that we've ever run at Seattle University, we call it Intersections, SEX, was for students who consider themselves to be people of faith and also queer, gender or sexually identified. And it was an incredibly popular group where they could simply come together, share their experiences in a way that they didn't have to punch through these preconceived stereotypes, and find ways to build a master narrative or a script that enabled them to be more of who they can be. So again, David, echoing your excellent opening comments, what can we do? We can remember how absolutely complicated it is for us to build this sense of self, this cultural capital in a world that can offer very, very confusing messages about who we can be and how we can be, even as folk who are supposedly on the margins. Opportunities to come together and have the occasion to be able to self-articulate, to be able to share our complexities, share our expertise, share our own knowledge, and not seen as simply the victims of prejudice or people who are suffering, but people who have something to offer and something to contribute can be very enriching. Thanks again, everyone, for being here and for letting me take this little bit of time.
Well, thank you, Jody. I would like for us to continue to complicate our picture by bringing in the perspectives of isolation and belonging that persons of color and those who do not claim Catholicism may have on our campuses. Omar, if you will.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. You're going to notice my lights turning on and off, so I'm going to keep moving because there's a motion sensor, which requires me to keep moving. I want to build on these excellent comments, both by David and Jody. One point I'd like to build upon in terms of what I'm pulling from within Jody's comments is that at this particular age, our students are in this process of searching and self-discovery. It doesn't mean that they will find what they are seeking, but part of our responsibility is to help them in this search. And to put in perspective, I try to keep track of the questions that I receive in my office. And if we had this conversation about 7 years ago, the most common question I would receive in my office would be, how do you reconcile free will and predestination? And then that began to evolve to, how do you reconcile suffering with in this context of merciful divine? Then those questions start to get overtaken by questions of, how do I deal with my anxiety? And so notice a shift from theological questions to more questions about the self and the journey of the self. Last year is our first time in person since the pandemic began. The most common question I had was, how do I make friends? I have no friends. I'm all by myself. And of all the different eras of questions, those questions would have the most tears. And so yes, absolutely, these students are experiencing this loneliness, this isolation. What has also changed over the years has been the fora, or the platforms that are used for connection. And I think Jody made the point of distinguishing between social media and I forgot the word, the language you used, but for the students, the most common platform for communication, for interaction, for learning about the world was TikTok. But now that's beginning to get overtaken by Be Real. And Be Real is something I just found out about, and I tell them it's probably be fake. But the point here is that this is where a lot of communication is taking place, in place of face-to-face communication. And I've been teaching for nearly 2 decades. I watched an evolution of interaction where the students would originally call me if they had a question. That started getting overtaken by students emailing me if they had a question. That started getting overtaken by students texting me if they had a question. Now it seems as though they try to avoid any of those forms of communication and just try to track me down in other ways. So the point I'm making is that the pandemic is one contributor to this. Technology is another contributor to this search for the self and the complications of the search for the self. In the context of Muslim students in particular, the undergrads we have right now are almost entirely younger than 9/11. And so they have no memories of 9/11. They've all been taught about it, but they've all been raised in the shadow of 9/11. And until our national foreign policy discourse focused on Russia, or our domestic policy discourse focused on white supremacy, often Muslims were at the center through hostile depictions. I mean, already it's very common, and this is consistent for minority and marginalized groups very frequently, that when we speak of ourselves, we'll speak of ourselves according to our ideals. And when we speak about the other, we'll speak of them according to the worst of their stereotypes. And so this is what my Muslim students have especially experienced through much of the course of their life and their lives. And so they've already been conditioned by the time they come to campus that the world is a hostile arena against them. And this, I think, is also similar to the experiences that many of our other BIPOC students have gone through in different capacities, whether we speak about African Americans in the context, Chicago, of police brutality, or Latinx in terms of just the sheer desire to be given attention, but then the absence when we see things like the consequences of the hurricanes and such. And so the point I'd like to draw our attention with that example is that everything is local and global in the same person's consciousness. That if I am being otherized, then who do I find as my fellows of my identity? And so the last point I want to draw our attention to after these most common questions, after social media, after the mix of politics and consciousness, is simply this point of identity. that in the way that our identities are fluid, there's also very often an emphasis to enforce specific types of identity. Obviously, this is the case in terms of gender and sexuality, but even if someone is self-identifying as a Muslim, there's an assumption of a certain type of religiosity, separate from sectarianism, whether we're speaking of clothing, whether we're speaking of devotion level, whether we're speaking of social interaction. And that becomes almost, dare I say, a type of coercion that the students find themselves having to conform to, that if they are not that, then they have to separate themselves from what they perceive to be the mainstream. And thus this leads to yet another realm of isolation. What actually happens on most campuses is, in the case of the MSA, the MSA might represent 20% of the Muslim population. And that becomes the vocal majority, unintentionally. The other 80% are students who may either decide in advance they don't fit in, or may find that they don't fit in, but they're looking for spaces to fit in. And so those are hopefully some contributions to our discussion. And then I'll hand it back to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much. Omar, that was wonderful to hear from you and your comments. And finally, I asked Deb to share some of her observations of student culture with regard to overcoming loneliness and isolation.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for everyone that's here today. I thought it might be helpful to think about this in the context of what's been happening for particularly our current traditional age students, and what their educational experience has been over the past 4 years. So for our seniors, really the pandemic started in the spring of their first year of college. So most of their college experience has been in pandemic times. For our juniors, they started college in the pandemic in the fall of 2020, where many of them either started remotely or some sort of hybrid form. And if they were in person, there were tons of regulations and restrictions. They missed all of their senior year traditions, proms, graduations, accepted students' days at colleges and universities, and in-person orientations. Our sophomores entered college with vaccine mandates, the start of the Omicron and Delta versions of the virus, which really had higher contagion rates, higher number of students of COVID, and higher number of students spent time in isolation. They spent most of their high school experience in remote or hybrid learning, and many co-curricular activities in both high school and now in college were on pause or canceled. Orientation for them was often remote, hybrid, or not at all, and real strong limits on social gatherings. And now our first year students, the class of 2026, are a little bit more in the post-pandemic times, spent most of their high school experience remote or hybrid. And again, if they were in person, they had serious limitations. But they were really the first group that was able to visit colleges in the spring to help them make their decisions. So really this time of isolation and all of the things that we're talking about today, they were in remote communities. They had Zoom fatigue. They were learning by listening and watching for the most part. I had a student once say, I haven't written a paper in 2.5 years as they transitioned from high school to college. We use terms like social distancing, contact tracing, and asking students to find meaning about the pandemic while they're in isolation. So really spending so much time in isolation during their formative years of college, we see a lack of interaction and not learning those social norms. They're figuring out ways of proceeding, being able to make a phone call or a text or an email, in, again, isolation. Because of the way colleges and universities had a flip in enrollment management, they got answers through bots, viewed campus through virtual tours, read reviews. So they were making decisions and making meaning, again, in a virtual world. Some, as a result, became paralyzed by in-person interactions, don't quite know how to make a new friend or a roommate. They don't know how to respond to a question or write that email or, God forbid, make a phone call. And then families were often behind the screen, right? And many still are. So the guidance of family members, helping direct them form those relationships. So as a result, the coping mechanisms, some of the resiliency skills, some of the social capital that we've been talking about today was really stalled during those time periods because, again, we were asking them to do this in a virtual world. Here at Loyola University, Maryland, 45% of our class of 2022 utilized counseling center services. 45% of the senior class utilized counseling services. We've had historical averages of closer to 12 to 15% of our community using counseling services. Mental health conversations are more the norm and the concerns are more common. Again, if you Google mental health on TikTok, you get millions of videos. I looked at just one TikTok today about suicide prevention. It had 4.4 million views. So again, when mass communication occurs, it feels like these things are become more of the norm. The social norming becomes mental health is an issue. Anxiety and depression are the most common reported concerns. And when you're seeing this level of engagement on social media and in the community, you ask yourself, I must have it too. We see that from students quite a bit. Because relationships are so difficult to initiate in this group of students, when they actually do find friendships or relationships, romantic relationships, when they end, they're really difficult on both students. Not only because it took a long time to create them, but they have fewer relationships and they tend to be a bit deeper. So as a result, we might see behavioral issues as a result of ending those relationships, whether that's higher levels of anxiety and mental health issues, whether that's conflict, resulting in things like stalking or other types of behaviors that are not appropriate in our communities. Well, at the same time, students are not afraid to utilize services and resources. And how do we help students not only seek the external assistance, but to build that internal resiliency? But with this, there's also a sense of hope. Students really value in-person experience. I'm not sure about your campuses, but since we opened, students are coming out in droves to anything that's in person. The engagement in campus life is high, and luckily we're seeing a little bit less of alcohol and drug misuse. So really, how do we help students take this opportunity now that we are back in person and we're asking them to make meaning of a variety of different things, from the racial reckoning and that we've occurred during the pandemic to the war in Ukraine and everything in between? How do we ask them to make meaning of those things by coming out of isolation and into community? How do we shift our conversation with students to overall well-being rather than mental health? So how do we help them think about them as whole persons, not just developing relationships with others, but relationships with themselves in such a way that they take into consideration their overall well-being? I think Jesuit education is well poised to respond. Our sense of cura personalis, not only to think about care of themselves, but care of each other, to think about how issues of the common good during the pandemic could lead them into lives of meaning and purpose now that they're back within that sense of community. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. And thanks to all of you. We are really fortunate to have your thought leadership guiding our discussion today. And I'm looking forward to engaging you in some questions. As we continue, I welcome our participants to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A function. But first, of course, I have some questions for the panel to consider. And panelists, I invite you to engage one another in dialogue as well as responding one-on-one to the questions. So the first question is, I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. And this is purely in recognition that it's actually more than students who are combating feelings of isolation and searching for community on our campuses. And I am working from the assumption that faculty and staff are searching for meaning and purpose as well as students. And I'd like to go back to the question at the beginning of life-affirming narratives. And panelists, reflecting on your own experiences as faculty and staff members, I'm curious how you experience community on campus. Conversely, I'm also curious if you're able to share, are there ways that, that we on campus might reinforce feelings of isolation for faculty and staff? And I open this question to all of our panelists, but certainly would welcome comment from Omar and Jody to begin.
To emphasize the point that this is something beyond the students, so I have a long history of community work in the Chicago Muslim community, and in all the circles that I'm involved in, maybe I'll have maybe 10 deaths of students, family members or such. During quarantine, I had 70. And then in the period of quarantine, maybe there will be one successful suicide, although not a handful of attempts. And in the period of quarantine, I had 8. And some of them were in their 20s, half of them at least were in their 50s. And so this is absolutely affecting people of all ages. In terms of my own efforts and such, my challenge is that I have to get away from the students. That this is probably a record for the longest amount of time students have not bombarded me in my office. Now, moving beyond student interaction, I have a very tight relationship with my colleagues here in ministry. Part of it is just we respect each other quite a bit, but we also get along very well. I also have a role on campus as a faculty member, and so I've been, because of how wonderful my ministry time has been, I've also been trying to re-engage with the faculty side on things like trivia night and such like that. And then in terms of community beyond that, students are always asking me, Muzaffar, like, what do you do? Do you have a social life? And I tell them, no. But I'm very frequently in the company of scholars and such, not necessarily talking about scholarship, but talking about life itself and just trying to navigate everything from how horribly bad the Chicago Bears are to, how do we get our children to listen to us and such. And it is, however, an active process. It's something that can easily become passive, and we can tell ourselves it's organic, but relationships must be cultivated, actively cultivated. And that would be the suggestion I would give to everyone. And those students, in my experience, that have the most healthy relationships also tend to be have the most amount of resilience against the struggles of life. Those that have the least tend to be the most vulnerable.
I will say in a word, students. So I love my classes, and I can honestly say that I've always found a great sense of community and engagement with my students. One of the things I challenge in my classes, which are mostly sociology and women and gender studies classes, is I teach a seminar on transgender studies, intro to LGBTQ studies. I challenge the students to try to think beyond the stale debates and partisan divisions and identity politics that divide us, and to think about how we can take our conversations to a higher level. And then I hold myself to giving them the tools to help do that. And they show up with such courage and generosity that over the years, my pedagogy has, which is very informed by Ignatian pedagogy, but it's really transformed around how to get me out of the middle and get the students more into it. And the more I'm able to do that, I find it so enriching. I learn so much from them. Again, as I said, they're generous, they're courageous. And I have a contemplative practice where I try to watch my energy. Do I feel uplifted after an event or an occasion, or do I feel drained, even though it might have required a lot of energy? Teaching requires a lot of energy, but I always feel uplifted. So I'm continuously grateful to my students for showing up and for being a part of these conversations. And then also I'll be very candid. During the pandemic, bonding with other parents around those challenges has been a real source of unexpected community. I don't know any meeting I have that doesn't start off with who's doing what with school or this or that. So fellow folk in that regard.
I think it's just really important to remember that we too are subject to all of the cultural concerns that are affecting our students. And so as best we can, I'm going to keep bringing us back to, and what about us too, right? You know, it is about the students, but we have to be whole and well in order to engage them. And so along those lines, you know, several of you mentioned some of the many socio-political issues we've been experiencing over the last generation, and certainly our students' relationships to them. And, you know, cultural divides seem to be furthering disconnection rather than fostering friendships, rather than anybody, not just students, but all of us fostering friendships across political and identity dividing lines. And I'm curious, from any of your perspectives, how do you see the institutional structures and cultures of higher education deepen or exacerbate the broad social problems of loneliness and a diminished sense of belonging and community? So how are our institutional structures contributing to the problem? I'm also curious whether you see a distinction between the on-campus experience of these divides versus what we see in the rest of society. And I'll toss that out for anybody who's brave enough to answer.
I just have one thought, I guess, to start us off, which is that I think the institutions and the practices can provide a certain measure of structural support, but they can be hurtful when they don't breathe, when they don't have a way of being flexible around issues or needs or, you know, whatever is emerging at the moment. So I think the institutions can do two things. On the one hand, they can be a reliable, you know, stable sort of structure with expectations and predicted outcomes and things. But on the other hand, I think really support if they can be flexible and breathe around various issues and matters.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's so very true. I think that the fact that we do have structures that people can rely on, that they may foster some community, and also what we're doing on campus, I think collectively is around meaning making. So that can be very helpful. So I appreciate that. What about from others?
I would add to this. I'm trying to think how to parse this in a thoughtful way. As the other panelists, as all of you have remarked, especially for traditional age students, this is a time in life when, you know, they're really trying to figure out who they are. And our culture, particularly our current paradigms and language and ideas around diversity are so wonderful. I mean, when I started teaching, and I'm not kidding here, it took an entire term to explain to students that things were culturally relative. You know, they just didn't believe that. That was the big aha at the end of 15 weeks. And you know, fast forward, you know, now we're in this amazing time where we have made such great strides in the last couple of decades. And at the same time, I think we have a couple of things back to institutional structures. We have much more increased demographic diversity, particularly around race and ethnicity, class, social class, inclusion of LGBTQ students and others. But have we changed the table manners? We've invited more people to the table, but in many ways, we're still insisting that people cleave off much of who they are in order to fit into institutional structures that were never created for most of us. And that's an institutional question that I think we're addressing fairly well. I think the more challenging one for young folk is, as they try to sort out who they are in a world that's increasingly complex, it can be difficult to show generosity and genuine curiosity to others. And so there's a tendency to, as we've heard now, you know, cancel culture, to if your politics and your beliefs don't mirror mine, then I have to shut you out. And I think there's so much room in Jesuit higher education to help give them the tools to think in a much more open-hearted and genuinely curious way about who others are in a way that can be enriching to self. You know, improve your resilience and your interrelational capacity, rather than to have this what I call tyranny of solidarity. And you mentioned this about the Muslim Student Association, that you have a few folk who are very articulate, but I always worry about the silent majority. You know, all of these students, staff, and faculty who are not feeling represented in some of the demands and the insistences and that of others, but feel that they have to show up as a form of solidarity because they're associated with this minoritized, or you know, not a term I like, but this marginalized identity. So how do we develop the tools and capacities for moving through that? I'd say that's very much that's the work that we have ahead of us.
It's so interesting, Jody, that you ended with that question, because that actually is the next question that I was going to pose to the group, right? You know, and there are sort of two things at play, and I think you named them well, that, you know, we have, when we're talking about identity politics, it can be very difficult for people to find commonality, right? And to share with one another authentically and have compassion and empathy for experiences that are not one's own or similar to one's own. And, right, at the same time, if we are trying to increase sense of community, and this question comes from one of our participants, asking about how do we promote belonging even as we recognize the seriousness of difference. And I think the question is about students, and particularly students in this case, might fear these efforts of belonging as assimilationist, or trying to reduce difference to the some common denominator that not everybody belongs to. So I think we have a question, right, around how do we help one another engage authentically from a place of whatever that difference might be, knowing that there are some real identity politics that may get in the way.
Two reflections. One just relates to the transformation of relationships because of or through social media. That on the one hand, we have this capacity to be connected with people all over the world. I'm connected with so many of my extended family members that without social media, I may not even know they existed. On the flip side, as we all know, social media makes it very easy for people to be in their silos. That these are the like-minded people, these are the people where I thus feel safe. But as a result of these silos, no one's talking to anyone. And that we're seeing at the political level, that's what we're seeing on the ground. And so regarding this first point, I think it's especially important that as educators, as university staff members, we really, really encourage people to take the university experience and get students to place themselves in environments or in conversations that they may not be familiar with. And this is one of those rare times in a person's life where you can do that and still be at least theoretically safe. But within that, I think we also need to push the notion of reconciliation, that I must see your humanity before I see your political opinions. I must see my humanity as being vested into the well-being of your humanity. That's the first thought that I have. But taking this then a step further, I think regarding identities, a point that I make to my students very frequently is we need to learn the terminology, but then I also find terminology to be very limiting. And even if we're using terms like power and privilege, I find that to be very, very limiting. And so an exercise I have the students do is, don't tell me who you are in terms of nouns or verbs, or nouns or adjectives. Tell me who you are in terms of verbs. And then this requires them to first understand that gerund is not a verb, but then to try to define whatever it is they want about themselves by way of action. And I think that exercise in itself provides a little bit of freedom from the limitations of identity in terms and such.
Yeah, Michelle, I think one of the conversations we've been having lately is how do we help students understand that not everything is either or, right? That there are instances that have both and how do we use that in our own language as stewards of our institutions, and then also, you know, helping students understand that something that might appear to be two opposing goods might actually both be true. And, you know, helping students understand that in the context of these conversations is not something that I think they're gaining, certainly at a national level or outside. That there's always a pick a side, and rather sort of thinking about what's the good that you can take out of in their language each side that could help advance your sense of knowledge and critical thinking. Not to mention your sense of community here while in college.
Thanks for that, Deb. And let me, I know we have some questions coming in the chat, so I'll turn to those in just a second. But coming off of, Deb, what you just said about the both and, right? And Omar, what you were talking about in terms of reconciliation and seeing one another's humanity first, right? And engaging with our own selves as human beings first. It brings me to think about the assets and resources that we have because we are at Jesuit institutions. And I wonder if there's anything that we can draw from our shared tradition that might offer some practical solutions to some of the issues that we're discussing.
Yes, resoundingly yes to that. As I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking that an additional capacity that enables us to listen for one another's humanity and be, you know, Levinas is my, I, and thou, to really participate in that is you also have to have the capacity for being in what I call inescapable scratchiness. I got that term from Irma McLaren in her book, Black Feminist Anthropology. But as she points out, we have to sit with and be with, and this is in a way a contemplative Ignatian process. We have to be genuinely interested in meeting the other where they are and aware that that might not be comfortable for us. And I think as institutions, we move too quickly to try to remove discomfort or gloss it over, rather than recognize that the stretching and the internal wrestling, which again is very much part of the Jesuit tradition, you know, with this discernment processes in which I have to sit in discernment with things that may be difficult or challenging for me, that there are ways in which we can design activities and exercises that give our students the opportunity to develop similar capacities to wait through the first response or the first reaction or the first sense of I don't feel safe with this, or I don't like this, or this isn't my opinion, and wait a beat, which sounds simple, but it's a very much a cultivated practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that and say that I think one of the strengths is the possibility of designing exposure and interventions where students can approach things that are frightening or scary or different, sort of one step at a time. It doesn't have to necessarily be dunked in all at once in a way that they're being overwhelmed, although those opportunities can be really helpful too. But I think that the pedagogy and also the just the values of the intellectual pursuit, we would like to form a value of looking at all points of view, of exposure to more than one position, so that it's actually a practice. It doesn't become just a point of view, it becomes a way of being.
Thank you both for reflecting on that. We have, and I want to continue on this path a little bit, but I'm going to take it a slightly different turn. And beyond our resources as Jesuit institutions, I'd like to spend a moment reflecting on our faith traditions. And so for David and Omar, if you can talk to us about the possibilities on the relationship between faith and navigating isolation and loneliness? And also, are there any misconceptions that between faith and isolation that might be helpful for our participants? And this comes from definitely taking some liberties with it, but that question comes from one of our participants.
One of the fruits of spiritual practice is the reduction of fear, and that is a core spiritual process over time. It should make us more courageous or comfortable, maybe is a better word, with things that are different from us. Or the other dimension of this, I think, is just being open by compassion. That cultivating that as a value and as a lifestyle creates boundaries that are more fluid, more open to people and to difference.
Yeah, I would say that faith is simultaneously very communal and very private and intimate. You know, in Muslim tradition, for example, the fasting of Ramadan, which now takes place during the school year, is a very, very private, intimate act that you're doing with a big chunk of the population, if not the big chunk of the whole world. And so the reason religion survives the test of time is that you can find your place in that. Introvert, extrovert, someone who's very communal, someone who's very, very personal and private. And I do think religion promotes both as well. It promotes deep personal introspection as well as community building and community participation and community obligations and such. So the tools are definitely there. For my Muslim students, that they're at a Jesuit school is almost secondary for them. I mean, they're at the school for various reasons academically. And I try to really get them to appreciate the fact that we're in an environment that takes faith as seriously as it does, as opposed to many other schools that might give space or tolerance or might be dismissive to faith. And they really discover it after they leave and see how wonderful things were. But I think this is back to the point of reconciliation. This is also something that should be emphasized to build community, if not within tradition, then across traditions, because this is a special time where you can do that.
I don't think your students are alone in finding greater value after they leave a place than while they're in it. I think that's a fairly common experience. Another part of our institutional identities that we share certainly is our academic traditions. And so this question comes from one of our participants, and it's really about the curriculum. And the question is, how do we craft curriculum, both broad and in the individual classes, the syllabi, so as to promote belonging, and which this person also notes is also a factor in enthusiastic learning. So the question around promoting belonging through the curriculum.
Again, I'm mindful of a Audrey Rich quote where she said, you know, if I look out and there are no teachers or books or, you know, any of the things that reflect me, I feel that, I'm paraphrasing here, I feel invisible, or if I'm not seen. And I think that's so true. I think there are so many ways in which we can not only pick reading material and social media and other course content that's richly diverse and resonant with our students. And I like the term resonant with them, but also to help bring more of them into the classroom. I find it really motivating to think about ways in which I can come up with activities that bring them into the center with one another. One of the activities I do is called creative sharing. And it's once every couple of weeks, they take a concept that we're working with for the class and they can do an art project, a poem, a little skit, interpretive band, you know, music, anything that speaks to them around this concept. And at first they always say, do we have to do this? But then it becomes such a wonderful opportunity to go around the room and see a little bit of everyone else. And I get to learn things because they bring their own content. You know, they introduce content to the rest of the group. And there's an aliveness in that moment that feels very connective, I think, for all of us. So any of the ways in which we can think not just about us being the experts, of our material, but how can we broaden in and bring in what they have to offer. It's very motivating for me.
Thanks for that, Jody. And what you were talking about, first of all, I love that exercise that you're describing for your class. I can see where students would be intimidated by it at first, but also how lovely it is. And what you were sharing reminds me a lot of the concepts of inclusive excellence and creating different avenues so that learning is accessible for all of our students and that they all feel and see themselves in the classroom and in what they're learning. So I appreciate you sharing that very fine example with all of us. Any other thoughts on the curriculum or what can be done or could be done?
Every year it's a journey to figure out what is the vocabulary of the incoming class, which includes what apps do they follow and how do they interact with each other, and then that helps to figure out where to go from there. I'll give you an example of the evolution of all this. In my Intro to Islam class, it's very common for us to watch the Spike Lee 1992 film of Malcolm X. And when I was teaching in 2004, it was a film that the students found to be very relevant. But then as soon as Obama was elected, students felt that this was a relic of the past. Why are we watching this? And then in the Trump era, this seems even more relevant to the students and such. And so some of it is just a process of even trying things that worked in the past and try them again. But I share Jody's experience. I also have students write skits, and the process, they've grown. But when I ask them, did you feel like you learned? And unanimously hands go up, and then we vote for extra credit. Who's the best skit, who gets the Academy Award and such. But yeah.
Thank you for that. I have two really, really good questions. And I know there's one that I do want to end on. So I am picking. Okay, well, since we just, Omar, you had said earlier, you gave us you gave me a new social media, Be Real. I had not heard of that, so I'm gonna have to look that one up. And you just referenced social media. There is a question that asks about social media as part of it. So I'm gonna turn to that. And the question is this, from one of our participants. What are best practices for engaging students, faculty, and staff in thinking more carefully about the alienating effect of in-group conformity, especially when social media discourse and performance of selfhood powerfully reinforces in-group rule following as the norm? That is a big question. And I think it's important for us to talk through as we're thinking about isolation.
I want to jump in on this one because of another exercise that I do that works well, and I want to share. I have students in my research methods class do a series of what I call strong reflexivity exercises. They're Ignatian informed, and a lot of it's to get them to think first about who they are in the position of supposedly a researcher but also just a human being. And one of them is to, when they're sitting with other people, when they feel themselves not listening and waiting for their turn to speak, they're beginning to dismiss or gearing up their own counterpoint, to just take stock of that for a week. They come back absolutely shocked at how they just come back and say, it turns out I never listen. I'm just always waiting, to argue or to push back. Another one is to interview a friend or a peer about something that is a point of complexity or contradiction in their lives. And in just thinking about the exercise, it takes them to a place of wondering who's left out, who's included. And they come back very humbled by the experience, by having talked with somebody about how they grapple with something. And I think that it helps them understand that one of my students said to me once, the most valuable thing you told me is that nobody else is cares about how I look or how I'm presenting, because they're too worried about how they look or how they're presenting. They come back very reflective. And so again, building this capacity, as David talked about it, and I think all the panelists have, of being curious about and able to enter into perhaps walking a little bit in the shoes of the other without thinking that they need to fix it or counter it or respond to it, can build some pathway through fear and some beginning of more curiosity and openness. And it's fun. It's another one that's really fun for them to report out on.
One of the things I really like about what you just offered, Jody, well, one, I feel it is very Ignatian in terms of reading the data of our lives around a very particular question, right? You know, how am I showing up? Let me take stock in what's happening inside, and being connected to the affective experience as well. The other thing that I like about that, and where I think this pushback around social media and the ways in which we perceive others and ourselves, right, is this guarding against this tendency to think of ourselves and those who are most like us as more complex than people who are different from us, right? We tend to think about people who are different from us in very simplistic terms. And I appreciate that you're inviting students to enter into that space to consider the complexity of another. That's really lovely. Anybody else on this question?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think this is where the examen could really play a role in students' life, teaching them the skill of being grounded within a sense of gratitude, and thinking about their days and how in which they are in fact interacting with each other in person rather than on social media. So, you know, I have similar concerns in that, you know, sort of the doomsday scrolling moves students towards, you know, that higher anxiety, that higher rate of depression. And how do we put practices in place like a sense of gratitude or doing the daily examen to help students contextualize their in-person lives more than their social media life.
Thank you so much for that, Deb, and also for bringing us back to our Ignatian tradition that we all share. We are about at time, so I would love to close out with one of our participants has asked for panelists to recommend readings or other resources that can help us continue to frame our work in diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging in terms of our shared Jesuit Catholic mission. So I'll give each of you a chance. If you have a reading or a resource to offer our participants, that can be one of the ways that we say goodbye.
It's a bit long, and I'm happy to share with anyone who emails me. But the last chapter from Gloria Anzaldúa is this book, this bridge we call home, is called Conocimiento, or Now Let Us Shift, and it's a wonderful and very Ignatian informed. She wasn't informed by Ignatian, but it's very Ignatian aligned way of thinking about how we have to grapple with the demons or the wounds within before we can do the work of finding and making bridges across differences. It's really highly recommended. I give it to my students as a final reading.
It might be a bit peripheral from Ignatian pedagogy, but it's still the same universe. A website that's called A Common Word, and it's focused on Muslim-Christian dialogue, Muslim-Christian reconciliation, with the awareness that the world is just going out of control in terms of its polarization. It's not just our society. And so the responsibility is on all of us to make sure those conversations happen. These are the exact conversations I have with the Jesuit scholastics on campus, that I have access to spaces that they don't. They have access to spaces that I don't. And we have to work to get everyone talking to each other.
There's a psychologist named Roy Baumeister, who a number of years ago wrote a really excellent article on belonging. It's an old article, but it's a very good article for background and just general orientation. And it's titled Belonging.
You know, I think in the app world, or the podcast world, I think there's lots of opportunities to engage our Ignatian tradition, even in apps. Examin's my favorite one, but I know there's there's others out there too that, as I've talked with students, introducing them to these self-reflective tools, I think helps them show up in a different way when we're having conversations around identity and around difference in the world.
Well, thank you for that. And panelists, if I can have you just stay on for a minute longer. I will thank you now, though, for all of the wisdom that you shared, and for that I have several pages of notes here and things that I need to think about in terms of what you have offered to all of us. So on behalf of all of our participants, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. But hang on for just a bit. And for everybody else who's listening in at home, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you and look forward to seeing you at the next National Seminar webinar.